Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today's video is bowl gouges 101. There's a ton of different bowl gouges out there, and in this video we'll cover all the different grinds, the types of gouges, and what they're used for, and how to sharpen them. If you're new to turning bowls, the choices for bowl gouges can be a little overwhelming. In this video we'll try and boil it down, keep everything nice and simple for you. But let's start with what makes a bowl gouge, and what differentiates it from a spindle gouge. The biggest thing is going to be the flute depth and the diameter of the bar stock. So you can get a 1/4, 3/8, and a 1/2 inch spindle gouge, but if you look at the flute's going to be a lot deeper on a bowl gouge, and it's generally going to be a little bit narrower as well. The reason for having that deeper flute is going to allow those chips to clear more efficiently, to allow you to remove more material quicker, as well as the bevel angle is going to be substantially different from a spindle gouge. Bowl gouges are traditionally at a 50 to 60 degree bevel angle, where a spindle gouge is going to be anywhere from a 35 to a 45 degree angle on the nose. So that's generally the biggest difference between the two. Another thing is the length of the gouge. These are going to be a lot longer. They're going to have a longer milled section, allowing you to get a little more life out of the steel as well. But generally, they've got a little bit deeper flute, and the nose angle is going to be quite a bit different. Generally, when it comes to bowl gouges, I break them down into basically 4 different categories. We have our traditional roughing gouges. That's going to be a basic fingernail grind. This is going to be used for removing bulk stock, getting wood out of the way, and getting our rough shape. And I generally will go with a 1/2 inch, 5/8, or a 3/4 on the size of that gouge. This is going to be used just to get wood out of the way and get our basic shape. After our basic bowl roughing gouge, we're going to have an Irish grind gouge. This is very similar to our bowl roughing gouge and can be used in the same fashion, except it's got a lot longer wing on the side to allow for shear scraping, and we'll cover that on the lathe. After our bowl roughing gouges, or our shaping gouges, we're going to have our refining gouges. These are going to be a lot smaller tools, generally a 1/4 or a 3/8 diameter tool. Having a smaller tool allows you to be a little more precise, getting a cleaner cut as well. Generally this will be done once I'm close to my final shape. I'll go over it with one pass with a push cut or on the interior of a bowl, and it's going to have a smaller nose bevel as well as leaving a cleaner surface and a cleaner cut. The next type of gouge is a bottoming gouge. This is used primarily for the inside of a bowl, and the steeper bevel angle on this allows us to make the sweep in that tight radius on the inside of a bowl, and it has a couple different ways we can cut with it and a few different variations in the grind. So we'll cover that once we get to the lathe and show you how important this gouge is to have in your toolbox. Alright, let's go over how bowl gouges are measured. It can be a little bit confusing because the Europeans measure it different from the Americans. Americans generally measure by the bar stock, so the diameter of the steel is going to be the listed size of the gouge. Europeans, on the other hand, they measure the flute. So this right here is a 3/8 gouge, but it's a 1/2 inch bar. So with a European measurement, you take whatever the flute width is and add 1/8 of an inch to get the bar stock diameter. But in this video, I'll be covering everything by the flute width. So I'll be covering this all based on a European measurement. So that way, if you're following along and I say I'm getting a 3/8 gouge, that means I'm going to have a 1/2 inch bar stock gouge. Or if it's a 1/2 inch gouge, it's going to be a 5/8 bar stock. So again, Europeans measure by the flute, Americans measure by the bar stock diameter. So when you're ordering tools, just keep in mind, make sure you read the description, whether it's measured by the bar stock or the flute. So, before we go to the lathe and start turning, let's cover the different steels that the gouges come in. M2 high-speed steel is the standard for bowl gouges, and that was a really big advancement back in the 60s, 70s, was when gouges started coming in M2 high-speed steel, because the wear resistance over high carbon steel was so much greater. Since then, there's been a lot of different steels come on the market, like powder metallurgy tools, cryo-treated tools. You can see a couple here, the M42, M42 cryo, as well as M2 nitrided tools. And the biggest thing is they're all chasing to have a longer lasting edge, because all these gouges are going to be used to remove a lot of material, and you want to be at the lathe as much as possible and spend less time sharpening. So if you can afford a more premium tool like the M42, you're going to see more performance and longer time on the lathe before you need to sharpen. But if all you can get right now is just an M2, that's going to be the place to start. So we do have a full-length guide on different steels that you can get gouges in. If you want to see a more in-depth video on the steels themselves, we'll link to that in the description. But I think it's time to go to the lathe and show you the different cuts and when to use these gouges. So let's head over to the lathe. Now that we're at the lathe, let's start out with our bowl roughing gouges. These are going to be, I usually start with a 1/2 inch minimum size gouge up to a 5/8. So that's the European measurement, so that means this has a 5/8 diameter bar. So the bowl roughing gouges, again, I like a 50-degree grind on those. 50, 55 is going to be a really good starting point. But the first thing we want to do with this gouge is we want to get our piece to round, and by doing that we're going to be removing a lot of material. That's why we go with these little bit heavier gouges. So with this grind on here at a 50 degree, I've got a slight sweep to the gouge as well. A nice little radius that's going to give me a good wing to cut on as well. But what we want to do is we want to have our cutting edge at center, and I've got my handle fairly low, and the flute is at about 10 o'clock position. I don't have it completely closed. I don't have that really open, because if I do, it's going to be very aggressive. So I want that at about 10 o'clock, and this is going to be a good cut to get this thing rough down to round and start removing a lot of that bulk right here. As far as our lathe speed goes, we'll turn this on. We always start at 0 and bring that up to speed. And I'm going to be about 800 RPM. Once we get this to round, we can bump that speed a little bit. But again, we've got our handle low, flute about 10 o'clock, and we can just start removing some material. The nice thing about these heavier gouges is I can take a really heavy cut. And now we need to move our tool rest over just a little bit. And as we mentioned before, the spindle gouge versus a bowl gouge flute, spindle gouges are really shallow and wider, where a bowl gouge is a deeper flute and a little bit closed off. But you can see the shavings we're getting. Those shavings are allowed to flow through that flute very efficiently, and you can see those big curls we're getting off there. It means we're taking a really good cut. So the bigger the gouge, the bigger the cut you can take. So on a bigger 12-inch piece, I'd probably go to a larger size gouge just so I can take a little heavier of a cut, as well as having a thicker tool, a little more mass would help as well. I slow down and ease that cut off there because these fibers are unsupported. Once I start getting a gap between my tool rest and the piece, I'll stop the lathe and move that in just to make sure my tool is fully supported during the cut. But at this point, you can see the surface finish we have on our piece. Right now would be a good time to go to a push cut, and I'll show you that here in just a second. But right now, the way we've been cutting, it's kind of a scraping peel cut in a sense, because I'm not really riding that nose bevel. I'm not on a bevel support, it's just touching the underside bevel here on the wing, and it does leave a fairly rough surface, but it's really good for moving a lot of material fast. As far as the push cut goes, we want to move our tailstock out of our way, that way we have room to move our handle. And we'll set up our tool rest just a little bit further over. And with a push cut, we're going to be riding this nose bevel here. That's going to allow us to have a more supported cut, as well as we can start further in on the piece, and then we can swing that all the way around and get a little bit better curve as we're doing it. So before I start my push cut, I just want to make sure that this surface is nice and trued up. So I'm just going to scrape across the surface here. So now that we have this face cleaned off, that'll give us a nice area for that nose to enter the cut without bouncing and kicking out of the way. And with the push cut, you want to make sure that you have enough room to swing your handle. I'm just going to retract that, put my revolving center away for just a moment. But I do have the handle quite a ways away from my body because I want that bevel pointed in the direction of the cut I'm going to be making. And then as we finish that cut, we're going to be swinging that handle around and moving. So the best thing to do is get in a position where the cut will finish, and then move your body over to start the cut. And I've got that flute about 9:30, just shy of 10 o'clock. And then I'm going to start moving my body, riding the bevel. And you can see just how much better that surface finish is with that push cut versus that kind of scrape we had on the other cut. So if we stop and take a look, you can see the torn fibers here on the end grain versus that bevel riding cut was so much cleaner. So generally speaking, when I'm roughing a blank, getting my rough shape, I'll do that first cut we did where it's more of a scrape, riding that wing bevel, and then once I'm getting close to the shape I want, I'll switch to a bevel riding push cut. So let's refine this. I need to cut my tenon for my chuck, so I'm going to do that now. Sometimes if you're pushing too hard, you get some shavings that'll build up in the flute. It'll clog the flute up. So now I'm going to switch to a smaller gouge. This is going to be a 1/4 inch bowl gouge, so a 3/8 bar. The reason I'm switching to the smaller one is I need to get in there and make sure I've got enough access to cut my dovetail correctly. With this bigger 5/8 or 1/2 inch gouge, this is too big and the bevel's too long. So I'm going to switch to a smaller gouge. We'll pick up the cut right here. And then we'll cut the appropriate size taper for my chuck jaws. And you could also use a spindle gouge to do that same cut. So now that we have our tenon appropriately sized, I'm going to move my tool rest over and do another push cut on the outside to get a better shape. Again, I like to have my body in position where the cut's going to end, and then I lean over to start my cut. And again, that flute is about 10 o'clock, 9:30 to 10. And then I ease that off right here at the end. So that's going to be the main use for your bull roughing gouges on the exterior of a bull. We'll get to the interior in just a moment. But before we move on, you can see these rubbing marks here from the bevel from me pushing too hard. And this is when you want to go to a smaller gouge, which a lot of people call the refiner gouges. That's going to give you a better clean surface on the exterior of your bull as well as the interior. So we'll switch from the 1/2 inch gouge and we'll pick up our smaller 3/8 gouge or the 1/4 inch gouge. You can see the bevel on these tools. This one's got a really long bevel on it, which means there's more metal contacting the wood during the cut, which can lead to these basically these pressure marks from pushing too hard with the bevel. So the other thing too is having a lot of weight on this tool. You just generally tend to push a little harder on these bigger gouges. Where with a smaller gouge like this 3/8, I can take a very light cut, very fine, and it'll give us a better surface and it'll get rid of these marks before we move on. All right, and generally with these refiner gouges or the smaller ones, when I'm trying to do a cleanup cut, I also increase my lathe speed. So I'll bump that up by about 20%. So same thing, start where you're gonna finish your cut and then lean over to start. And I'm focusing on minimizing bevel contact or bevel pressure. But this push cut's going to give me a really clean surface, and I can focus a little bit more on my shape. And then I ease off at the end of the cut right here and I raise the handle slightly. But let's stop the lathe and take a look. So you can see we have these little marks here just from the angle of the bevel changing as I'm making my curve, but I don't have any of those really deep compression marks or any of the oscillating marks you get from me pushing too hard on the bevel. And that's a really clean surface. If this was a dry bowl blank, this would be a really good finish. I could probably start sanding with 220, but I'm happy with the curve on there. And we also have a really clean cut tenon as well. So those are just a couple of the differences between, you know, a refiner, smaller type bowl gouge versus your bull roughing gouges that are generally going to be your larger gouges, and the reasons for using each one independently. So let's flip this piece around. We'll start cutting out the inside and show you the different cuts you can make on the inside of a bowl with the bottoming gouge, the refining gouge, as well as the bull roughing gouge, and show you the couple different cuts you can make, as well as our Irish grind on the exterior once this is flipped around. So let's get our chuck and we'll flip this piece. All right, so before we start hollowing out the inside of our bowl, I want to cover our Irish grind before we do that. So the biggest difference between a fingernail grind and an Irish grind is going to be the length of the wing right here. So if you look, this is our bowl roughing gouge, this is a traditional fingernail grind, and then we have our Irish grind here on the bottom. You can see the wing length is about twice as long as a traditional fingernail grind, and the reason for that is so we can shear scrape on the outside of a bowl and have a really long wing to shear scrape with. So that's going to be a really good thing to do, and if you watched our scraper video, you saw shear scraping with that spear point. And that's kind of what the Irish grind was traditionally made to do before those spear points came out. And when we do our shear scraping, the handle and the bevel angle and everything is going to be quite a bit different than we were doing with our bowl roughing gouge. When we do our shear scraping here, we close that flute over quite a bit. Basically, this is a 4 o'clock position, so that's past 3, rolled over to 4, and we've got that handle really low, and that allows you to shear scrape and refine your curves and take a very fine shaving. So if you're trying to minimize tear out or just refine the curve just a little bit, shear scraping is going to be when you want that Irish grind gouge. So David Ellsworth was really well known for his grind. His is basically a modified Irish grind. And the nice thing is you can take any traditional bowl gouge and grind it with an Irish grind on there. So as far as the bevel angle goes, again, those are about 50 to 60 degrees depending on how steep you want your nose. I've got mine grounded at 50, but the biggest thing is it has a really long grind on the side, and we'll show you that once we go to our grinder. So let's turn this on and show you how to shear scrape with an Irish grind. So I've got that handle really far down below my waist, and I've got this rolled over about 4 o'clock position, and we're just cutting on the lower wing. And as we remount this piece, it will be slightly out of round, so you can use your Irish grind to clean this up and true up our surface. But you can see, let me grab some of the shavings. We're getting a really fine shaving. If it's like a spider web, that means you're getting a really clean cut. If I stop our lathe, you can see we don't have any tear out there. And the nice thing is the shear scrape is extremely controllable. So we'll start down here, just truing up that surface, getting rid of any imperfections or outer roundness from remounting the bowl. Again, that flute is about 4 o'clock position. And right there, once we're getting closer to the rim of the bowl, I need to adjust my tool rest. So I'm just going to swing that over a little bit. We'll try and capture some of these shavings here. Super fine shaving, that's what we're looking for. And then if you're looking to refine or blend any curves together, shear scrape with the Irish grind is a really good way to go. Another thing too with the motion of the gouge, before we'd start in that position and then we'd move our whole body where we're not against our body. There's a lot more input from your arms. Where with a shear scrape, I've got this tucked against my hip and I'm just slightly rotating over. I'm trying to keep my arms and the tool in a fixed position, and I'm just moving my hips over slightly as I'm making the cut. So if I start here, I'm just moving my hips to the right, keeping that tool trapped and pinned against my hip. And it's that easy. That's the nice thing about a shear scrape is you get a really fine cut and it's really easy to control. So that's going to be the main use case for an Irish grind gouge. The other thing too is you can use it as a traditional bull roughing gouge. Because you have a lot longer wing, you can take a heavier cut. That's why a lot of guys like those, but its main purpose shines really when you're doing a refining shear scrape cut. So I'll set my Irish grind off to the side and we'll start roughing out the interior of our bowl. All right, so we just showed you the Irish grind and how you can shear scrape on the exterior of the bowl with that. Let's go back to our bowl roughing gouge. It's going to be our fingernail profile as well as it's going to be that 1/2 inch or 5/8 bar stock on the tool. We're going to be using this to rough and get rid of a lot of the material on the inside of our bowl. Once we have that out of the way and we've run out of room for our bevel angle and we need a little bit steeper tool, we'll go to our bottoming gouge as well as we'll show you some smaller finishing cuts with a smaller gouge. But first, we want to clean up the surface on this, get this sharp corner here removed, and we'll be removing a lot of the bulk on the inside. And to do that, we've got our flute at about the 1 to 2 o'clock position. And we want to start with the nose of the tool making the entry cut. Once we're on our bevel, we can open up that flute a little bit, and we're just looking to remove the heavy material from the center. So again, got our piece going about 800, 900 RPM here, and we're going to start in the center. And a lot of guys, they'll make a lot of roughing cuts all the way out to the rim, but we want to go just kind of straight in, just removing that bulk in the center. So I want to make sure that my flute is in the correct position. And make sure you take off your watches or bracelets or anything. But once that nose is engaged, we're going to open up that flute slightly and just go straight to center. Again, you want to make sure that flute's closed about 3 o'clock when we start. And once we have bevel support, we can open up that flute a little bit. And there's a couple different ways you can hold your hand as well. You can put your hand underneath, put your fingers in the flute itself, and that way you're just supporting it underneath, allowing that tool to move. That's a great way to do it. A lot of guys put their hands on top. If I'm just doing roughing cuts and I'm not worried about bevel marks or surface finish, that's usually what I'll do is I'll have my hand on top of the tool. A lot of guys will put their thumb on the tool rest to support that gouge initially. But just find a position that's comfortable for you and allows you to move the tool as you need it. But we're getting a really heavy cut. On this size of a bowl, that's about as heavy as a pass I'd do. If this bowl was larger, I'd be going to a larger gouge as well. But you can see just how good this excels at removing a lot of the material to get that out of our way. But you can see that little island we've got built up in the center. And this will be removed with our bottoming gouge. Because right now, I have to get this handle, especially as the curve or the depth of the piece increases, I have to get further and further over to where eventually I'm going to be hitting the tool on the rim of the bowl, and I don't want that because the bevel angle is not steep enough on the nose of our roughing gouge. Again, this is a 50 degree. Our bottoming gouge is going to be a 60 degree, allowing us to stay away and stay clear of the rim of the bowl and get this bottom island area removed out of our piece. So I'm going to thin this out just a bit more, and then we'll show you some cleanup cuts with the smaller gouges or the finishing gouges. So I'm going to clean up my rim a little bit, get rid of that wax layer, and then I'll use the wing of this just to chamfer that. I don't like having a sharp corner on my piece. But as we get thinner and thinner on our piece, the wall thickness is getting thinner. You can't take as heavy of a cut because it's putting more pressure on the wood as well as more pressure on the bevel. And as the piece gets thinner, it starts flexing. So that's typically when we'll switch to a smaller gouge, and it'll give us a cleaner pass as well as putting less stress on the timber. But we do have a pretty clean surface on here from this gouge. So let's set this off to the side. So as our piece becomes more delicate, our cut needs to be as delicate as the piece. So we're going to switch to a smaller 3/8 or 1/2 inch bar stock gouge. This is going to allow me to get a smaller, more controllable cut. And this will be putting less pressure on the bevel. Pick that cut back up. And that should give us a really clean surface. So you can see we really don't have any bevel rub marks. or any tear out as well. And that allows you to maintain that curve we want, but it's just taking a smaller cut that's more controlled and is putting less pressure on the wood. So that's when I would want to switch to a smaller gouge, is when I'm getting to my final wall thickness. We can thin this out about half as thick as it is right now, make it just a bit thinner. So that cut is about 3/16, and that's a little heavy for this size of gouge, so I'm going to step it down, take about half that. And let's check our wall thickness here. Yeah, we're about 3/16 thick. I think that's all we're going to do with our finishing gouge. We're going to switch to our bottoming gouge now to get our final wall thickness down here in the bottom and get rid of this bulk in the center. So we'll set these off to the side. All right, so we're going to switch to our bottoming gouge now, and the biggest difference between these and our traditional gouges, these are going to have a really steep nose on the front, 60 degrees, and you can see on this one here I've got a really square across grind on the nose, where this top one is a little bit smaller tool, as well as the tops of the wings are drawn back slightly. You can run them either way. I prefer to have the wings slightly drawn back myself. A lot of guys like to run this square across the front so they can shear scrape upside down, as well as cutting on this back wing. It's going to be a little less grabby if you have a straight wing, but I personally like to have my wing slightly drawn back a little bit. But you can see the different thickness on these gouges. This is going to be a 1/2 inch or a 5/8 bar gouge. This one's going to be a 5/8 or a 3/4 American measurement gouge. So depending on how deep and how far over the rest you need to get, that's when you need to pick a little bit thicker tool. If I'm going to be over the rest 4 or 5 inches, I'm going to want the heavier duty gouge. If I'm only going to be 3 to 4 inches, I'm going to go with the 5/8. So I'll set those off to the side. I've got this one sharpened. You can see it's got the wings slightly drawn back at the very top, but it is a 60-degree nose. So let's turn this on. Actually, I'm going to adjust my rest in just a bit. I want as much support with the tool as possible. And there's a couple things to know when using this tool. Because it doesn't have a nose or a pointed nose like our other gouges did, we can't enter a cut from the rim of a bowl because it's going to skate on us, because there's not a tip that's going to get on bevel support. We need to start on the bevel in our bowl first to make the cut, and we can't start out here at the rim. It's just going to skate back on us. So first we want to remove the island of material here in the center, and we've got that flute about 2 o'clock. And because the thickness of the gouge is a little bit thicker than that finishing gouge, I'm going to drop my rest ever so slightly so that my cutting edge is right on center. But because that bevel angle is so steep on the nose, the tool is really far away from the rim, and we're not going to contact the rim. The only downside to that super steep nose is if we're starting out here on the rim, to get the right bevel support we need, that handle has to be a long ways away. You hear that chatter? If we're getting chatter like that, I'm going to grab some shavings and I'm going to support the outside of the bowl. We'll pick up that cut, swing the handle round, and then I can go back to here because now we've got thickness. And we can finish the cut. The nice thing about these bottoming gouges is it leaves a really clean surface. You can see a little bit of a transition line right here from where that cut ended. But we've got a really good curve on there, and if we need to, we can always pick it up right here just to clean up that surface and get rid of that tool mark. But this is a very versatile gouge. We can cut on our left wing by leaving that flute slightly more open, or we can roll that over and cut more on the nose and the right wing as we make that curve. But this is going to be the gouge you need to get down into the bottom of the bowls, and then just making sure that curve is nice and perfect. And the great thing about it too is that super steep nose and a short bevel means we don't have a lot of bevel contact, so we don't get a lot of those marks. And it's really easy to control how much pressure you're pushing into the piece with your bottoming gouge. So you can see that curve we've got on there, really nice wall thickness and consistent all the way throughout our piece. So if this was a dry piece of material, this would be ready to finish and sand. But that's going to be the use for our bottoming gouge. But you can tell all the different cuts we've done with the bottoming gouges, our roughing gouges, and our finishing gouges. Very versatile tools, and they all have a unique place when you're turning a bowl. You could turn it all with a single gouge, but there are limitations and you'd find those out pretty quickly. So now that we've shown you the cuts with these gouges, let's go to the grinder, show you how to sharpen these, because there are a few different techniques when you're sharpening the bottoming gouges versus a traditional gouge or an Irish grind. So let's get this cleaned up, we'll get our grinder set up, and we'll show you how to sharpen these gouges. Now that we've shown you how to use the tools, let's show you how to sharpen these tools, and we'll give you some few tips and pointers along the way. So the first thing we want to do, we're going to be sharpening the traditional gouges first, and I like to run a 50-degree grind on those. So what we need to do is first set our V-arm. This is going to be the easy grind system. Setup is going to be the exact same for the vari-grind system or the Wolverine. But we're going to set our Raptor, so this is our 50-degree Raptor here. Set that down in our V-arm pocket, and then I'm just going to advance that until both points are contacting the wheel. Once that's set, every time I use the grinder and use the jig, I'm going to have a 50-degree grind on my tool. So it makes it nice because it's easy to have a repeatable grind every single time. All right, once we have our V-arm set, we need to set our tool protrusion on our tool holder, and that needs to be 2 inches. So I'm just going to advance that up in the jig and lock that down. And I want to make sure that it's nice and tight, because if it's loose at all, I go to grind that, it's going to be trying to push the tool out of the jig, and it will slide back, and it could cause an issue, and it'll definitely screw up the nose of the tool. So once we have this locked down and our V-arm set, the next biggest thing is our hand position when we're using the jig. Every time I see guys with their hands on top of the jig, that's kind of the way we taught it a long time ago, and that was the way I was doing it until I got hurt. This is just going to cause you to get injured if you have a slip off of the wheel. So what happens is you're grinding here, you're pushing into the wheel, and then this will skate off and it'll jam your hand between the wheel and the vari-grind jig. So that's going to cause a lot of problems. The way we do it now is we keep our hand down here on the V-arm. I keep one hand up here on the tool. I usually keep my thumb in the flute of the tool, and then I just pivot and rock it. The great thing about doing that is if it slips off, my hands aren't going to contact the wheel at all. So the other thing too is having my hand on the V-arm down low, is that gives me a nice anchor point to keep that tool right in the center of my wheel. So now that we have everything set up, we're ready to grind. Make sure you have eye protection on, and we will be using a CBN wheel to sharpen. That's going to give me a really fine bevel and a really razor sharp edge. So let's turn our grinder on. Once that's up to speed, I like to start with the wings first, and then I blend the nose to the wings. So I'm going to start right here on the side of the wing, rock that over, come back, and you can see I've got my support hand down here anchored on the V-arm, and I've got my hand over here holding the tool. I'm just going to rock that until this side's clean, and then I'll come over here, and I like to put my finger on the side of the wheel housing and then my thumb on top of the jig here for the wing. And then I can just rock that back and forth. But by having 2 points of contact down in the V-arm and then the side of the housing, this is really secure when we're doing this. And if it slips off, my hand's not in the way of the wheel or the jig. Go back over to this wing again, anchor down low on the V-arm. And with these CBN wheels, you don't want to push hard into the wheel. You'll overheat the steel. So I'm just using the weight the weight of the jig and the tool to put the pressure onto the wheel for me. And once I'm happy with the wings of the tool, you can see just how good that grind looks on both sides. Once I get my wings ground the way I want, then I'll go back in and I'll grind the nose. So again, I've got my hand down low on the support, and I'll usually start on the right wing and then just sweep over to the left and then sweep back right over to the right side. It's really easy to overgrind the nose of the tool and have a little scoop in the nose of the tool here. That's going to cause a lot of problems when you go to use the tool on a piece. So I do the wings first. Once I have my wings established, I'll go back, just do a quick pass across the nose, and that's going to give me a really clean grind. And again, we're going to do the same thing with my finishing gouge. This is also a 50-degree grind. So we'll set that in our protrusion gauge. Same thing, anchor down on the V-arm. We'll grind the wings first. Switch over to this side, anchor off the side of the housing. Take a look at it and make sure you're happy with the wings, and then I'll anchor back on the V-arm and do a pass across the nose. And that's going to give us a really clean grind. So that's going to be it for our roughing gouges and our finishing gouges. Now we'll do the Ellsworth or the Irish grind. So the biggest thing with this is because that wing is a lot longer, there's a couple different ways to establish that. So this is also a 50. You can run a 60-degree nose if you want, but I think I'm going to run a 50 on this guy. But the biggest thing is you can adjust the leg angle of your vari-grind jig or the easy grind jig. You can make that a little bit steeper. That way you have more access to the wing depending on how long you want the wing to be. But I'm going to leave this one as is. And basically all I'm doing differently is I'm just swinging that around more to where I'm engaging more of that wing and then grinding that a little bit longer back. So we'll run a 50-degree on this, and we'll show you just basically just rotating that jig further over to get a longer wing on here, but you can also adjust that V-arm. So same thing, anchor down low on the V-arm itself. And then if you need to, hold on to the side of the housing, but we're just rotating that a lot farther down, almost to where the jig is contacting the corner of my wheel. Again, we want those 2 points of support. That way we won't slide off the wheel. Come back over here and hit this wing. Same thing, bring that all the way around. Once you're happy with the wings, then we'll blend that nose again. And that's all there is to it for an Irish grind. We've got a really clean grind on there. You can see we have just a tiny bit of a secondary bevel that was a few degrees off from what we had before, but that looks nice and clean. We've got a razor sharp edge. All right, so now that we have a really clean grind on here, if you wanted to, you could always add a secondary bevel. Basically grinding away the heel of the tool. If you take a look at Glenn Lucas's gouges, they all have a secondary bevel. That just shortens the main bevel and gets a lot of that steel out of the way so you can make a little bit tighter curves, as well as having less bevel contact with the wood, meaning you're gonna get less marks on the inside of your piece. If you wanna do a secondary bevel, we've got a 2.5-inch jig, basically sticking the gouge out of the jig another 1/2 inch, and that's gonna just grind the heel of that tool away. So if you do wanna do a secondary bevel, just get the 2.5-inch jig, and that'll give you a different grind, shorter bevel, and it'll leave a little less tool marks in your piece. Now that we've shown you the other ways to sharpen the different gouges, now let's do our bottoming gouges. So right now we've got our square across the front bottoming gouge and then the slightly swept back wings on this gouge. So we'll start with this guy first with the slightly swept back wings. We'll do that in a jig, and then our square across the front we'll use a platform for, and we'll show you that in a second. So with these, we want a 60-degree bevel. So we'll use the 60-degree Raptor here. So we're gonna loosen up our V-arm, slide our jig out, and then bring that back until those points contact. Lock it down. So that's gonna be our 60-degree nose angle. Again, we want 2 inches of protrusion on our tool. Get that locked down nice and tight. And this is going to sharpen basically the exact same way as we did our other gouges. I want to do the wings first, and because this doesn't have a nose on it, we're going to do just a quick pass on the nose, and that's going to be it. So we'll start out with the right wing, anchor off the side of the housing. And this one doesn't require much to touch it up. So we're just going to go a couple passes on the wings. And then I'm just going to go 1 pass across the front. That's going to give me that super clean bevel we're looking for with a slightly swept back wing right here. All right, so now that we're going to use the platform, let's take our V-arm out. We'll set this off to the side. And to use the Raptor for a platform, we'll use it upside down. We'll use this front face here on our platform, and then we just need these 2 points to contact our wheel. So we'll bring that a little bit further out. Okay. I want to make sure I don't have a gap between the wheel face, or sorry, the platform face and the face of our Raptor. And then we want these 2 points to be contacting. So once we have that, we can lock this down, make sure everything's nice and snug, especially the platform, because you don't want that to slip and fall into your wheel. That can cause a lot of problems. So 60-degree nose. And as far as it goes with the platform and this gouge, what we want to do is we want to keep that square across the front, keep that tool nice and straight. We're going to basically cut those wings nice and square across. I'll do this wing here, and then we'll do a quick pass across the front. That's going to maintain a square face on the front of our gouge. So with this, I just want to make sure my tool is anchored to our platform. We're going to keep this tool nice and square to the wheel. And then I'll do a quick pass across the nose, and that's going to be it. It's really easy to overgrind the nose, so make sure you take the time on the wings, and then just do a quick pass across the front of the nose, and that's going to maintain a super clean bevel. You can see I have a secondary bevel on here that's really ugly, but it doesn't matter because I'm not ever contacting the wood with that piece. But our cutting edge and our cutting bevel here, that's going to be nice and clean, and our wings are nice and square across the front. So that's how you sharpen the bottoming gouge on a platform. In this video, we've covered different gouges, when and where to use them, and most importantly, how to sharpen them. So hopefully you guys learned a few new tips on how to implement these bowl gouges better in your next project. And if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the section down below. And as always, subscribe to our channel for more wood turning videos.